Well, here I am with best-selling author Cynthia Thurlow. This is her fourth time on the podcast, and she just wrote a great new book called The Menopause Gut. And we're going to talk all about the gut hormone connection for perimenopause and beyond. Cynthia, congratulations on the new book. And, your first book was on the intermittent fasting transformation. We're both huge advocates of intermittent fasting. I'm wondering what your feedback was on that book and what inspired you to write this new book, The Menopause Gut.
Yeah, I think I've always been incredibly passionate about metabolic health. Obviously, I spent 16 years in clinical cardiology as an NP, and the intermittent fasting and transformation book really came out of a talk that I gave in 2019. And I think that fasting is a really powerful strategy to support our bodies, especially given kind of the food culture and the food frequency culture that we have here in the United States. We eat too often, we eat too much of the wrong foods. And the evolution from that was, I've always been talking about women in perimenopause and menopause, and felt like, because I, like you, have a podcast, that there was a deeper conversation around middle-aged women that I wasn't really hearing, really specific to the gut and how inputs related to our health as we're aging impact the gut microbiome pretty significantly. And, in 2024, my editor reached out to me and said, "Do you think you have a second book in you?" And I'd been saying no all the way along. And I said, "Well, I might have this idea, and I think it's a really unique lens on helping women understand their physiology as it's changing from the gut microbiome lens, because the gut microbiome interfaces with every body system." Traditional allopathic medicine likes to silo everything, but I remind them that the gut interfaces with, the gut ovarian axis, gut bone axis, gut brain axis, et cetera, et cetera. And so the more we can understand and support the gut, the more we can support our physiology, especially as our hormones are declining and our neurotransmitters are changing. And intermittent fasting or digestive rest can also be part of that conversation, but just helping women understand, when is the strategy appropriate to utilize versus, when do we need to embrace a more gentle approach? And I'm sure these are topics we'll probably explore today, but I feel really fortunate to have had the opportunity to write a second book and, write a book that I think is such a unique lens on midlife physiology.
Yeah, absolutely. So many women are my wife is going through perimenopause now, and so many women go through this, obviously, the perimenopause, menopause, all natural. This is just part of the way God designed us. Yeah. But you have those natural hormone fluctuations, and there are symptoms that occur with that. And, there's a big relationship between your gut, your liver, right? Between some of these key organs and how these hormones function in your body and how they metabolize and the symptoms that women are experiencing. So let's tie all this together.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I was writing the book and thinking about digestive organs, and if I were to ask a patient, where does digestion start? They probably would say your mouth, which, whether I ask an adult or a child, that's kind of the prevailing thought process. But when we're talking about the digestive system and specific to women that are getting older, it's really important to talk about this estrogen processing center of the microbiome. So it's a specific type of gut bacteria that help break down and effectively break down and be able to eradicate or eliminate estrogen metabolites that we no longer need. So I think most people probably know that the liver really is the heavy hitter in the body for detoxification. There's two phases, and most of which, phase one is breaking down things into water-soluble compounds. Phase two is moving things into the gut. And if the gut is optimal, meaning if it's healthy, there are key enzymes like beta-glucuronidase that are helping to cleave off, break down estrogen, package it up like a present. That's the easiest way to explain it. And then poop it out of the body. But what typically is happening is that over the constellation of, our teens, 20s, 30s, the foods we're exposed to, our environment, our personal care products, synthetic hormones, and let me be very transparent and say that women need access to contraception until they're ready to have children. But, I think about the cumulative net effects of oral contraceptives that are given to young women at a very young age without really giving them fully informed consent about the impact on the microbiome. So over the course of our, younger years into middle age, I always say that toxins bucket can get filled over time. And this is not woo-woo, this is actual science. If you look at endocrine mimicking chemicals, they can offset those receptors for our hormones and can be up to 1,000 times more potent. So really important to just be conscientious about this. So for a lot of women, though, that have had accumulate, whether it's antibiotics, whether it's alcohol use, whether it's the toxins I mentioned, synthetic hormones over time, the gut, or chronic stress for that matter, the gut microbiome can get disrupted, including the estrobolome. And so the estrobolome, if we aren't able to effectively break down and package up and poop out that excess estrogen, it can get recirculated. And this is where, more often than not, we're seeing a lot of this magnification of midlife symptoms, the vasomotor symptoms, the night sweats, the hot flashes, breast tenderness, weight loss resistance, brain fog, joint pain, and it goes on and on and on. And so I find when I'm doing diagnostic testing, more often than not, the women having the worst symptoms, more often than not, are not as metabolically healthy, and they also have poor detoxification. And again, we detoxify, we breathe, we sweat, we urinate, we defecate. All these things help with that, but the gut really is the epicenter for this. And if it's healthy, and we can define what makes it healthy, but if it's on the healthier side, better diversity, less inflammatory species, et cetera, you're going to navigate middle age a little bit less symptomatically than the standard American individual that probably is. And I certainly see these women that have had 10 years of vasomotor symptoms, women that haven't slept well in 5 years, women that think it's completely normalized, that they're supposed to have consistent brain fog, joint pain, just feeling like they are a smidgen of what they once were 20 years prior. But I really think the estrobolome is at the epicenter of understanding how our hormones are being broken down and eliminated, or they're being recirculated. And let me be really clear, if we're recirculating a small amount of that estrogen metabolite, that's different. But what I'm really speaking to are people that are recirculating a large majority of those estrogen metabolites, which really just magnifies all the side effects. And I think perimenopause is really the storm before the calm. I think for many women, helping to reassure them that for most women, by the time they get to menopause, their symptoms typically are better than they were in perimenopause. Perimenopause really is a litmus test for how well we've been taking care of ourselves. For some of us, it's the realization we hit a wall and then we're like, okay, I need to change things. Others just keep, living like they did at 18 and wondering why their body and their physiology is feeling like it's working against them.
Yeah, it's a great explanation. And during perimenopause, both progesterone and estrogen go down. So the production goes down as a whole. But what tends to happen is the progesterone drop is more steep than the estrogen drop. And that can be related to stress, obviously, is a factor in that. But then also detoxification, like you talked about, because you might have an excess amount of these estrogen metabolites in the bloodstream. So then there becomes this larger gap, this larger ratio of estrogen to progesterone, and that can be related to a lot of these symptoms.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. The number one endocrine disorder in women is not an underactive thyroid. It's actually PCOS. So I think about all the women heading into perimenopause that are already dealing with low progesterone levels, presumably. And I think they're the women that become much more symptomatic. And not every woman with PCOS is obese. A lot of these women, there's a thin phenotype. And so I see a lot of women mid to late 30s that are becoming increasingly more anxiety, more depression, more trouble sleeping, especially around their menstrual cycle. And you're correct, this relative estrogen dominance for a lot of women, sometimes in their perimenopausal years, their estrogen levels or estradiol can be 20 to 30% higher in some cycles. We call it a loop cycle. That can really magnify these symptoms. And so it really becomes important to determine, first and foremost, what can we do with lifestyle? And then, if appropriate for that individual, thinking very strategically about the utilization of, maybe someone needs some oral micronized progesterone so that it improves their sleep, lessens their anxiety and depression. Because when I was going through perimenopause, David, what was effectively offered to me and all my friends were antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, when what we actually really, really needed was some hormone replacement therapy, plus or minus some targeted lifestyle interventions. And I think in many ways that kind of traditional allopathic model that I was once part of really doesn't focus as much on lifestyle measures. And you and I recognize how critically important, how much of a differentiator that can be for many, many women.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the telltale signs I see is high anxiety. I mean, our culture in general, we have a very anxious culture as a whole, but women that are dealing with this kind of chronic anxiety, and especially when they really haven't had like significant stress that may be causing it, just that mind racing anxiety. Oftentimes, if you're low in progesterone, because progesterone helps it's a GABA agonist in the brain. So it helps with GABA, your breaks in the brain. And so when you have that anxiety, that could be a clear sign that your body's not, it's low on progesterone. So that could be a major factor there. Are you seeing that as well?
Absolutely. And the really great thing about, compounded, if you take there's oral micronized progesterone. If someone has a peanut sensitivity or they want something that's sustained release, you can also compound it. But oral progesterone therapy has this wonderful effect. There's this metabolite called allopregnenolone that you're alluding to that upregulates GABA. And so GABA is this main inhibitory neurotransmitter. Not only does it help you fall asleep, but for many, many people, they notice a difference if they miss a night of their progesterone, how differently they feel. And for some women at the beginning of perimenopause, they may just need it a week or two prior to their cycle starting. It can be that easy. Obviously, the longer you get into perimenopause, you may benefit from taking it, throughout your cycle. Obviously, I'll defer to everyone's prescribers, but I think for a lot of individuals, it's both reaffirming to know that progesterone is what's actually driving a lot of those mental health issues. I mean, we can also make the argument that 70 to 80% of our neurotransmitters are produced in the gut. So if you have a lot of inflammatory species, a lot of dysbiosis, if you don't have a good amount of beneficial bacteria, that can make things worse. And thinking about that gut-brain connection, the vagus nerve transmits information, can transmit inflammation to the brain. So I think for a lot of women, it's helping them understand there's multiple ways to look at this. And sometimes it can be as important as really thinking strategically about what do we need to do lifestyle-wise in order to help this along with HRT if that's appropriate.
Yeah, for sure. Now, let's go back to the gut. Like, what's actually happening in the gut? You mentioned beta-glucuronidase, this key enzyme, which you can get tested on a stool test, like the GI map tests that. There's other markers, too, that they'll look at for gut inflammation, for dysbiosis or parasites, things like that. Great test, GI map. Let's talk about what actually is happening in the gut, what the gut looks like for somebody that's struggling with perimenopausal symptoms and menopausal symptoms versus a healthy gut.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just to give everyone a sense of the gut microbiome, it's 40 trillion bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protozoa that are contained in our large intestine or colon, heavily imprinted at birth, whether we're a vaginal delivery or we are a C-section, whether we are breastfed or bottle-fed, formula-fed. And there's kind of key times in a woman's life, and transparently a male's. Obviously we go through puberty, men and women go through puberty, and we get differentiation in the gut. For women, pregnancy and perimenopause are two other key times where we start to see changes in diversity. And so in perimenopause, with these hormones declining, especially estrogen, changes in diversity. So think of the gut as a beautiful garden with fruits and vegetables. And what starts to happen is the unhealthy bacteria starts to grow more fervently during this time period in the absence of hormones. So you'll get more inflammatory species. You'll get reductions in beneficial keystone bacteria. You'll start seeing more inflammation. Really at the basis of aging is inflammaging or immunosenescence is a drive in inflammation. And that doesn't necessarily mean that people are symptomatic. They may not feel the inflammation going on within their bodies, which is why many women will say to me, I do everything right. I don't need to replace hormones or even have a conversation. And I always like to help kind of fill in the gaps for them. We also get alterations in immune system regulation. So estrogen and our immune system are very intertwined together. When you're looking at the small intestine, which is the main site for absorption in our bodies, it's only one cell layer thick. And I always like to liken it to a brick and mortar system. So the estrogen is the mortar for the bricks, and that is where these tight junctions are. So as estrogen is declining, we start seeing more and more leaky gut. Leaky gut is a real thing. It's small intestinal hyperpermeability. When you leak food particles or endotoxin or LPS into your bloodstream, you're going to trigger an immune response. So women will talk about bloating. They'll talk about, sensitivities to specific foods, and that's a direct reflection of this leaky gut syndrome. Women are 4 to 5 times more likely to develop autoimmune conditions in middle age. And as I always like to remind people, I think when I trained in the 90s and early 2000s, there might have been 20 or 30 that we talked about. Now there are over 100, including long-haul COVID and chronic Lyme. So really, 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 this is when women will start getting those diagnoses, and that's a direct reflection of changes in estrogen. We know our immune system also gets a little cranky. That's how I like to describe it. We tend to be more susceptible to opportunistic infections. So when you talk about the GI map, seeing parasitic infections, worms, a lot of dysbiotic organisms, which are non-beneficial, Also really thinking thoughtfully about, the fact that as we see declines in these hormones, we would changes in motility. So not at all uncommon for women to say to me, God, I was 42 and all of a sudden I feel like when I eat a meal, it just sits in my stomach longer. Yes, there are some changes with the hydrochloric acid, which breaks down protein into amino acids. We get reductions in digestive enzymes. Estrogen and bile are intricately connected. So you may find that you don't break down fat quite as effectively, and it has nothing to do with having an unhealthy gallbladder. It is a direct reflection of how estrogen aids bile production. And so as bile production and fat malabsorption can be more problematic, that can also impact the estrobolome that I mentioned earlier. I think for a lot of individuals, it's interesting to learn that progesterone is a smooth muscle relaxant. So that can contribute to gut changes in terms of how effectively food moves through the digestive system. And then estrogen is a potent nitric oxide stimulator. So as estrogen is declining, nitric oxide production goes down. I think many people think of this in the context of endothelial function or the lining of the blood vessels, but it also, in fact, impacts the innervation of the gut motility. And then one other kind of big key takeaway is that we get a reduction in short-chain fatty acids. And so I think this is a really important concept for people to understand. It's why fiber becomes so much more important in middle age. And I effectively refer to fiber as the new F word, because depending on who I'm talking to, it can either be something people say, yay, I agree with that, or no, I think this is bad. We should not be talking about fiber. But when we consume fiber, it goes through our digestive system into the large intestine where it is fermented. And out of that fermentation with the colonocytes, we get short-chain fatty acids, which are signaling molecules. They're important for the mucus lining of the digestive system. Some of them, like butyrate, can cross the blood-brain barrier. And for listeners, the brain is designed to be impermeable. So the fact that these are effectively sending key information to the brain is really important. They're also responsible for our own ability to secrete GLP-1. So I know these drugs, they're very popular right now for good reason. We make on our own GLP-1s, but these short-chain fatty acids are really important for this. So all these things are changing, and it isn't as if it just happens one by one. Sometimes I think in many instances, based on symptoms that patients tell me, it is like the domino effect. One starts and then they all fall behind. And this is where I think the awareness around these things to expect is important, number one. And then number two, lots of ways to address this without feeling like you have to buy 50 supplements or suddenly change everything about your lifestyle. The last thing that I would add is, we know that women become less stress resilient in middle age. And it's important to note that cortisol is not a bad hormone, but it gets a bad rap. But cortisol high over time, not I'm engaged in this conversation with David where I'm excited. I'm sure if you measure my cortisol levels, it might be elevated, but in a good way. But when you're elevated, if your cortisol is elevated over time, cortisol is catabolic, so it breaks down muscles, it lowers immune system functioning, makes us more susceptible to infections. It also contributes to leaky gut. And so I think in many, many ways, this whole stress piece becomes a bigger thing that we have to talk about. I jokingly say, but I'm serious, it's not 5 minutes of meditation every Thursday. It really needs to be something that you are doing throughout the day, thinking about it thoughtfully, finding something that you like and doing it frequently, because that stress piece becomes so much more important, especially for those of us that, we're in the sandwich generation. So, we have aging parents, our kids are getting older. This is when people are more likely to have greater responsibilities at work. So there's so many more added demands to women in the sandwich generation that really becomes critically important to understand these things, because the more we know, the more we can prepare for, and the less symptoms we can experience.
Yeah, it's a great review there. And I agree with stress. It really needs to be a controlled pulse. And then you need to optimize recovery. That's really the key. When it's a controlled pulse, like exercise, right? Certain things that we're doing for performance, right? Even, getting heat stress from a sauna or cold stress for a very short period of time. If it's controlled and then there's a emphasis on recovery, right? Then you actually get stronger and more resilient. The problem is in our society is we never turn off the stress button. So we're in this chronic fight or flight and we don't have optimal recovery. We're not doing things to optimize our recovery. And I think that's so critical. And so going back to the gut, we've talked a lot about, the gut microbiome, how the body works, how we're working on detoxifying these different estrogen metabolites. What are your best strategies for supporting gut health?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really have to start with, the research is very clear about sleep is number one. We have circadian clocks throughout the digestive system, which is why if you try to eat before bed, it's really going to be disruptive, not only to melatonin secretion, but will otherwise dysregulate blood glucose. So number one really needs to be sleep. Because it's interesting, if you look at the research on sleep, even something as jet lag can disrupt the circadian clocks in the digestive system, and the microbes actually will actually adjust accordingly. So when you travel and you are 3 hours, like I just got back from LA, 3 hours behind. I just stayed on East Coast time, so I looked like a weirdo going to bed early and getting up early, but I stayed on East Coast time just to mitigate some of the effects on the microbiome. But it's very, very clear that sleep is number one without question, and sleep and stress go together. I know that sleep is an enormous pain point for middle-aged women, but show me a woman who doesn't sleep well, and I'll show you someone who doesn't manage her stress. So to your point, we know that stress in many ways can be incredibly caustic to the ovaries. There's a gut-ovarian axis, and whether we're looking at childhood trauma, adverse childhood events, we know that it can imprint the nervous system enough. The people that have experienced high ACE scores, so there's a joint venture between Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. Anyone that's listening can go on and take the short quiz. But for the individuals that have high ACE scores, and I trained in inner city Baltimore, so I saw a lot of big T trauma. But I think the chronic corrosive little T trauma is equally as bad, but it actually is not acknowledged. So, addiction, abuse, neglect, bullying, all these things can imprint our physiology. And so when I think about stress, I think about it from two different perspectives. Number one, we know that it can age the ovaries, and the ovaries are the most mitochondrial dense organ in our entire bodies, not surprisingly. But I think from the other perspective, it's that for each one of us, we have to learn to have better boundaries in middle age. I think that perimenopause is really this incredible litmus test of how well we take care of ourselves. And I find a lot of women, like whatever their strategies were in their teens, 20s, and 30s, suddenly become a little bit maladaptive in middle age. So really finding ways to create healthy boundaries, to learn how to say no, to effectively find ways to stimulate the vagus nerve, which we know is really important. Longest nerve in the body, runs the span from the brain all the way through the digestive system into the gut, and things that can evoke the vagus nerve. So singing, humming, gargling, some of those you can probably do in public, perhaps not others. But finding ways to stimulate the vagus nerve. And this is where, those recovery patterns become important. I think about how there are lots and lots of gadgets that are out there, which I love. I love gadgets, but it's the really simple things, breath work, taking 4 to 5 deep breaths before starting a meal, grounding work, getting out in nature. I mean, that's something that my husband and I have done. Gosh, for the past 10 years, we have several dogs and we walk them every morning out in the sunshine, connect with one another, talk. The teenagers are probably still asleep, but it gives us a way to kind of start our day in a more calmer parasympathetic state. So stress management's number two. Obviously, food is really important. I think no one will question that, but I would say for middle-aged women, have protein-centric diets become very important. We know that we need more protein at this stage of life, not less, at least 30 grams. And this is where I always say the intermittent fasting piece. If someone can get in at least 100 grams of protein a day, I don't care what their fasting window is. But I find for a lot of women, it becomes challenging in a 4 or 6 hour window, so they need to open it up. And I called 12 hours of digestive rest a minimum for everyone, irrespective of life stage. Even my 18 and 20-year-old can do that because we've tested just to see, can you manage that? And they absolutely can. The other piece of it is, if someone's not intermittent fasting or someone is still in that mindset, and this is advice I gave incorrectly when I was a new nurse practitioner, is that I encourage people to have 3 meals a day and snacks in between to stoke the metabolism. And so I think it's important to just identify that meal frequency becomes a bigger issue. We should be eating less often and really leaning into the protein piece along with fiber. As I mentioned earlier, our short chain fatty acid production goes down. And I know that's a big mouthful, but the big takeaway is, because that is declining, even if we are replacing hormones, it becomes more important to be eating some degree of fiber. And when I'm talking about fiber, I'm not per se pointing to a supplement. I'm saying, get it from whole foods. And that may mean cruciferous vegetables. That may mean low glycemic berries. For people that tolerate small amounts of beans, when I'm saying small, I'm not talking about 5 cups. I'm talking about maybe you're having a quarter cup, maybe you're having a couple tablespoons. I always use the example that when I go to Kava, I do double protein, and then I do a mix of arugula and lentils, and it's probably a quarter cup of lentils. It is not a lot. And for most people, they can tolerate and buffer that amount of carbohydrate. But helping people understand that fiber becomes really important. If you look at the estimates, the experts want you to have anywhere from 25 to 30 grams, but I generally recommend track your protein, track your fiber, and then increase from there. Because if you go from 5 grams a day, which is about the average for the standard American diet, anywhere from 5 to 10 grams. And you
5 grams, really? Standard American?
That's because it's so much processed food. I said if you suddenly go from 5 to 10 grams to 30, your microbes can't acclimate as quickly. So doing it slowly over time is really important. And then the other thing that I think is so important is really talking about exercise, or as I like to call it, movement, because some people find that the word exercise is so triggering, but thinking thoughtfully about movement in terms of strength training, zone 2 training, if appropriate for you, high intensity interval training, but getting really clear and granular about what are the things based on the research that are effectively supporting the microbiome. Being sedentary is not, eating a standard American diet is not managing your stress is not sleeping. I mean, those 4 big things, before we even talk about gadgets or supplements or hormones, I'm like, we have to really concentrate on majoring in the majors, as I call them, because they are so foundational to our health overall. And for a lot of women, they head into perimenopause not doing a stellar job on all of those areas, but these are things we can always change. And I'd be the first person to say that lack of stress resilience, or that developing less stress resilience, also moves into the exercise piece. Like the types of exercise I did in my 30s is not how I exercise in my 50s. And so it doesn't mean that there isn't a degree of intensity, but I'm not doing an hour of a CrossFit class. Like, I'm just not doing that kind of exercise. What I'm trying to do is maintain and build muscle, make sure that my mitochondria stay healthy, and then doing a little bit of sprint work, not so that I hurt myself, but so that I'm giving my body that hormetic stressor that I know your community is really familiarized with, to help support my overall health and longevity.
Yeah, that's great. And I know obviously you've been traveling a lot too. So like the better you recover is going, if you recover real well, sleep well, keep your stress down, things like that, that's going to give you a little bit more resilience as far as the amount of exercise. And when you're not recovering well, you need less. Even as a younger man, I was in my early 30s when we had twins, my wife and I had twins, and I was working out 6 days a week, really intense. And we had twins, and all of a sudden I couldn't sleep much, right? We would do shifts in a sense, right, to help my wife out. And so my sleep got cut in half, and I realized I started overtraining with my exercise because I thought I would keep the same workout schedule, and I couldn't. I had to back down. Now that the kids are all sleeping great, and I've got my home gym here, I'm able to get, I really focus on good sleep, and I'm able to get great workouts in on a regular basis. And so, anyways, that is something you also need to take into consideration. And yeah, with the nutrition, I also teach the same, like focus on protein, optimize protein levels. I used to, 10 years ago, I would teach fat doesn't matter, eat as much healthy fat as you want. And I realize now that actually it matters a lot. In fact, there's a lot of people that they really can't handle more than about 15 to 20 grams of fat in a meal. They don't break it down well. They feel sluggish. So I say, 15 grams or so of fat, don't overdo it, and see how your body tolerates it. And if you do good, you can try bumping it up a little bit, right? For some people, they can do high amounts of fat. I'm fortunate enough to where I can do higher amounts of fat and feel great. But other people can. So you really have to be careful with that. And then I always say lots of colorful fruits and vegetables up to your tolerance point. What I found is with fiber, it's kind of like a bell curve. Most of us are somewhere around the middle where we can handle a certain amount, a good salad or some good vegetables. Some people need a lot, right? And they feel really good with a lot of them. And some people need less, right? They actually need less. And they're the people that seem to do well on carnivore diets, right? They're the ones on that far side of the bell curve, but that's a smaller percentage. And then what ends up happening is somebody finds an extreme diet that works well for them, and they say everybody should be plant-based or everybody should be carnivore, when really that's maybe 5% of the population that does well on that. Most people are, again, more closer to the middle of that bell curve, maybe skewing to one side or the other. And you got to experiment and figure out where you land on that.
Well, I think that's such an important message, the value of bioindividuality. Like for me personally, and I talk very openly about this, I do higher protein, higher carbs because I don't tolerate a lot of fat, but it has a lot to do with my genetics. I happen to be a hyperabsorber of fat, and it explains why when I would eat a ribeye or duck or would have a piece of salmon, I would be like, gosh, I don't feel good. It's not an unhealthy gallbladder. I feel like I have to interject that automatically, but it's just that the way my physiology is, I do better with lean proteins. Which doesn't mean I don't eat fat. Let me be very clear. I do better with plant-based fat. And even recently did a fatty acid analysis with my integrative med doc, and we had a good chuckle. He said, I think it's amazing how attuned you are to your body. So now I take some supplementation for C15 because I don't actually eat dairy. And then there's one omega-6 product that I take, healthy omega-6. Let me be clear, we're not talking about seed oils. But I think for a lot of individuals, it's taking the time to figure out what makes your body feel good and what doesn't make your body feel good. Because the fiber piece, you're so correct in that I have some patients that do really well with 20. I have others that can do 50 or 60. And it's all about finding out like what works well for you and just being conscientious of knowing the big themes like protein centric, making sure you're getting some fruits and plants into your diet. What's interesting is I was full carnivore for 9 months after being hospitalized in 2019. And I thought every day, I couldn't tolerate the vegetables or fiber, but I thought every day about vegetables. And so I think we are designed to be more omnivorous, but that omnivorous kind of slant really is as bio-individual as we are as humans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to teach people all the time, eat lots of broccoli, right? Steam it, right? Whatever it is, eat lots of broccoli. And some people do phenomenal with broccoli, right? And so I don't want to say this is not a bad this is a bad recommendation. Like you love broccoli. A lot of people do really good on broccoli. My body does not do good on broccoli, but I do amazing on cucumbers. I eat a big Mediterranean salad that I make with cucumbers, tomatoes, olives. I put in feta cheese. I actually do really well on dairy, lots of extra virgin olive oil, lemon juice, right? And that's my favorite. Like I can eat cucumbers all day, bell peppers, right? Things like that. Nightshades I do great with. And so kind of figuring out the colorful, I always recommend getting lots of colors, right? I also like red onions and stuff like that. Lots of colors that you tolerate. And there might be foods out there that everybody's saying, this is a superfood, kale or whatever it is. But for you, it may not be. And that's okay, right? But for your spouse, it may be the exact food that they need to be eating.
Yeah, it's interesting. I am married to someone who loves pungent food. So like he loves red onion. I'm like, give me the Vidalia. And so it was interesting. When I was in undergrad, they were doing testing on hypertasters. And I'm a hypertaster, so I avoid the extremes. Like I don't like bitter coffee. I will drink green tea because I know there's lots of benefits. But even when I ate cheese, I couldn't tolerate the really strong cheeses. And so it's interesting how we kind of navigate figuring out for ourselves what really suits us best. And then not feeling like we have to apologize. Like I cannot tell you how many patients are so confused because they follow this one influencer or this other influencer. And I'm like, what they're doing is just giving you context of what works well for them. And that's great. But there's no one size fits all philosophy. We really do have to find out what intrinsically works best for us. And the one thing I want to say about polyphenol rich foods, which is what you're talking about, is that those strong flavors like olive oil, you don't want it to be bland. You want it to be a little almost like strong, like it almost feels like it's a little burn on your tongue. And that has a reflection of how much polyphenols are in there. So like I will eat radicchio and freeze and some of these more bitter compounds because that information is really valuable to our gut. There's this kind of prevailing thought process that 30 plant varieties over a week is really what we should do. And that's kind of my prevailing thought. When I'm putting together a salad, you could put 10 plant varieties, you can put herbs, you can put nuts and seeds in there. There's lots of ways to give your body that. I always say monogamy is good, but food monogamy, we don't want to be eating the same things day after day. Just giving our bodies different inputs because it's valuable signaling information, valuable information for the microbiome and the rest of our body.
Yeah, each one of those polyphenols has unique benefits, and actually cycling them has even more benefits. If you're kind of consuming, even with supplements, like if you're consuming turmeric every single day, turmeric's a good supplement for many people, not necessarily for everybody, but for many people. But if you take it every day, the benefits start to you start to habituate to it and you get less of the benefits. So cycling some of these things can be really, really beneficial. I think that's an important note that you're talking about there. And so you also mentioned exercise. Obviously, that's super critical, making sure people are prioritizing sleep. Do you have recommendations for helping people? Do you go through that with sleep in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. And we start with the really kind of benign things like cold, dark room, legs up a wall, reading a physical book before you get into bed. And then it kind of climbs through, supplements. And I'm a huge proponent of like, let's layer things in one at a time. So obviously magnesium, we know has solid research on it. And here's the thing that I didn't know until I interviewed a magnesium expert, a physician, was all forms of magnesium cross the blood-brain barrier. It's not just one formulation. So magnesium's helpful adaptogenic herbs, especially depending on where you are in your cycle, if you're still getting a cycle. So ashwagandha is both tonifying and can be stimulating, meaning that you can take it at night or the morning. I think about relora, magnolia bark. I think about rhodiola. So these are plant-based compounds that can be very nourishing to help bring cortisol down in the way that it needs to be. I think about myo-inositol, which, for me personally has been a total game changer for sleep, helping with sleep architecture. I think many people think about it in the context of blood sugar regulation, but now that the GLP-1s are out, I'm like, I don't think it's as efficacious as things like berberine if people are looking at that in particular. But then also just getting clear about meditation, vagal nerve training, again, the boundaries piece, getting off electronics. And there's lots of fun gadgets. There's lots of vagal devices that I think can be very, very effective. But I always say before we invest in a product like that, let's try all these other strategies. I think for a lot of people, it's hormone replacement therapy. Progesterone helps with falling asleep. Estrogen, when appropriately utilized, will help stay asleep. A lot of meal timing. So some of my patients, they're waking up in the middle of the night because they're just not eating enough. And this is where getting really clear and intentional about how much protein are you consuming, how far away from bedtime are you eating your last meal. Blood sugar dysregulation can wake people from sleep. So if I have women that are overtraining and underfueling, it might be that, they depleted their glycogen and that will spike cortisol. You can also get some blood sugar dysregulation. Some women are experiencing a lot of hot flashes and night sweats because they have a degree of blood sugar instability. And that's a separate kind of issue that we have to tackle. But those are kind of high level things that I think are helpful in a way that they're actionable and accessible. On the other side of that, there's lots of devices. I do like, Aura or a Whoop band to help people differentiate how much deep sleep are you getting, how much REM sleep are you getting. Not to be obsessive, but I think metrics can be helpful, as well as heart rate variability. For anyone that's listening that's not familiar with that, that is a kind of rough sketch of the balance between your autonomic nervous system, so parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. That's my tell. When I'm at elevation and traveling, I will always have my HRV plummet. It does not matter how much sleep I get. And it's a way that you can assess objectively, are you sufficiently recovered? Are you getting sick and you're starting to notice that your pulse rate's going up, your HRV is going down? To me, it's another kind of objective sign of not only stress management, but how high quality is the sleep piece. And then beyond that, there's lots of other gadgets. But I always say that the research is very clear about, there's a specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy called CBTI that is pretty efficacious with sleep support. So that has to be done with a licensed therapist, but that can also be very effective. It's interesting. I did a presentation at a medical conference last year, and I was shocked. To be completely transparent, I was completely shocked at how effective it is based on research. And for some people, that can be another layer. But sleep and stress go together. If you're not managing your stress properly, you will have sleep alterations, full stop. And I do think that that carries on into menopause. It's not just a perimenopause. Our hormones are all over the place, and this is why we're seeing this. This is sad to say, I think out of all the hormones, the only one that goes up in middle age, for women at least, is cortisol. So that's the tell. When you feel edgy, feel like you can't really relax and focus, that's why those stress reduction strategies will help you sleep better, but all really important.
Yeah, it's really key. Stress and sleep are so important to be able to manage that effectively. Now, both of us have written great books on fasting. We're both advocates of that. But there's a lot of controversy, especially in the female health space, about fasting and about cortisol and things like that. And so what is your take on fasting and its impact on female hormones?
I think it has to be taken into a larger context. And I always say this is this nuanced conversation. So are you sleeping? Are you managing your stress? Are you eating? Because sometimes I think there are a minority of women that hide their latent eating disorder in the guise of fasting. So are you eating to fuel your body? Are you over exercising? Now, if you're doing those things, then I would say we don't want to add more hormetic stress. However, if you are someone that is sleeping through the night, you effectively are managing your stress, you do eat a nutrient-dense whole foods diet, you do exercise but not too intensely, too frequently with not enough recovery, then I think intermittent fasting can be a good strategy. Now, do I think that women who are already lean should be doing a lot of fasting? No. This is something that I definitely have evolved on. I think for the majority of women, I think anywhere from 92 to 93% of the population at large is not metabolically healthy. So do I think that the majority of people can do a bit of intermittent fasting? Yes, around their cycle if they're still getting one, but being very conscientious of those other levers. If you are exercising and doing Orange Theory Fitness 5 days a week with no recovery, if you're sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, if you're super stressed, going through a divorce, moving, someone in your family is sick, and you're just not eating enough food during the day, then I don't think fasting is the right strategy. That's where I will say digestive rest is probably the right thing to do because you're still eating, you're just a wider feeding window in which to eat. So I always say, like, we have to be honest, and there will be seasons in our lives where that is appropriate for us. And then there will be seasons in our lives where our foot is off the accelerator. Right now, during this book launch, I am not doing a ton of fasting because I'm finding there are days I just can't get enough food in because I'm doing so much talking and traveling. So to your point, I think that it's important for us to be honest with ourselves and to also be transparent. Like, you know, am I noticing body composition changes not in the direction that I want them to go in? So I feel like I'm losing muscle mass at the expense of a longer fasting window. So I think it's body composition plus lifestyle. We just have to be really honest with ourselves and decide, is this the right season for this strategy? And it's okay if it's not. It's okay for us to change our minds for a period of time. It's also okay to say, I've taken a break for a couple months and now I want to go back because Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm going to intermittent fast because that's what makes my body feel good. I think that's great.
Yeah, that's those are great tips. And I always think it's really about the growth hormone to cortisol ratio, right? So if you're resting, like you should be secreting a lot of growth hormone at night. And growth hormone helps preserve your lean body tissue. So it counteracts the negative effects of cortisol. So if we have too much cortisol, it's catabolic, breaks down lean body tissue. And growth hormone protects the lean body tissue. So if we're sleeping well, right, going to bed early, blocking out blue light, all the different strategies you talked about, we should optimize melatonin release and we should have low insulin at night. So for optimal growth hormone, we need low insulin at night when we're going to sleep. So not eating too late at night, not eating lots of processed foods, all the things you've been talking about. And then we need optimal melatonin release. The more melatonin we release, the more growth hormone will be released. That's why they say every hour of sleep before midnight is equivalent to 3 hours of the regenerative capacity of sleep after midnight. The reason for that is we're going to secrete more melatonin if we're in bed early and more growth hormone, so the more regenerative capacity that takes place. And if we get optimal growth hormone release, which fasting can help with, then that will counteract the negative benefits of cortisol. But like you said, if we're under a lot of stress, not eating right, doing too much exercise, if we're in a moldy home, exposed to a lot of toxins, we have, relational stress, all those things are going to deplete our growth hormone release, right? And so that's really the key. You should feel recovered on a regular basis. And then that tells you you're getting the right fasting stress. You're putting the right amount of stress from fasting on your body to build resiliency.
Yeah, and I think it's important, I'm like a data nerd, so when I'm trying to get a sense of someone's a proxy to their growth hormone secretion, you can look at IGF-1, and obviously that declines with age. That's another way to kind of look at, where should you be and where are you? Because I think that that issue with mitochondrial dysfunction really starts to unwind after 40, and I think for a lot of people, they sometimes have to objectively look at their N of 1. Like, let's look at this number, and if it's low, then we probably need to do some other things to help support growth hormone secretion and lessen the stress. Because I think for a lot of people, David, a lot of women in particular, they're so disconnected from their bodies that if you were to ask them, do you feel like you're overtraining? And they would say no. But fundamentally, their HRV is low. Their heart rate variability is bad. Their heart rate is up. They're not recovering quite as well. They've lost their ability to be connected to their body, which I think can be from a variety of things. And so sometimes it's hard for these people to objectively assess, are they doing the right, and this happens to men too, are they doing the right strategy for themselves right then? And that's something that I'm encouraging women to, get acquainted with how they feel in their bodies, which again, for some people is incredibly challenging.
Yeah, so important. So important. Well, guys, this has been a great interview, and I would definitely recommend going out and checking out Cynthia's new book, The Menopause Gut. Great buy if you're going through perimenopause, menopause, or if you know you're going to be going through that in the next few years, or if you have a spouse, partner, maybe a mother that's going through that right now. Great book to get them for sure. And Cynthia, great interview. Any last words of inspiration for people?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is that the gut microbiome is incredibly malleable. So you might be listening to this and realizing there are a lot of things that you want or need to change with your personal life, but knowing that the gut is so malleable that even small changes like taking a couple deep breaths before you sit down and have a meal, saying grace, walking after a meal, just incorporating a little more protein into your diet or adding a little bit of fiber, those things have a positive net effect on the gut microbiome. So don't feel like you hear our conversation, you're like, oh my gosh, I have so many things to change. Just change a few things at a time. Very small things have a large net impact on our health.
That's great. And are you doing any sort of like special offer for people if they buy the book? I know obviously you can go to Amazon and look for The Menopause Gut. Is there like a special website too where people can go?
Yeah, well, what we're doing is we have a banner on my website that you can go to. And if you buy the book in pre-sale, and we're extending the pre-sale bonuses until the week after sale, these are actually guides that will help with the book. They're not, like throwaway, no one needs another pantry guide type of stuff. But we polled our audience, and there's like gut health guides, there's quizzes, there are things that can really help your understanding of the book itself and how it pertains to you. So yes, lots of bonuses that are available. If you follow the links through my website, it'll show you how to redeem those.
Is that just cynthiathurlow.com?
Yes.
Great.
Yes,
so
right
go to cynthiathurlow.com. That way you get all the freebies as well, all the bonuses.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. Always enjoy our conversations. Best wishes with the book launch and everything that you're doing. God bless you. And we'll see everybody else on a future podcast. Be blessed.
Thank you for having me.